And boy oh boy, are those things no fun to fix. No response. Death. The winters are brutal here. Even though I live in the city, just about every night, someone freezes to death. A good chunk of those throwing boiling water and watching it freeze videos are from here. Even if the sun is out, it still hurts to breathe. When the sun goes down, it hurts to exist. As soon as it gets dark, Fahrenheit and Celsius slam into each other in a horrid marriage of minus 40 degrees. The air turns into crystallized pain. No one walks slowly after sundown. He was staring at the rusted wheelchair ramp of my housing block, shivering beneath a pile of rags. I had forgotten one of my gloves at work, and the overfilled plastic bags I was carrying were cutting into my swollen hands. I was worried about losing my fingers, but I knew I couldn't live with myself if I let an old man freeze to death. "Hi, mister. I don't think we've met. I'm Alexei. Can I help you up this ramp?" "Stay away. I've nothing to give you." "Oh, I don't want anything from you, mister. We just hate to see a new neighbor freeze to death. So, how about it? Can I help you up this ramp?" No response. Too proud to ask for help. Yet, when I grabbed the handles of his wheelchair, he didn't resist. He just grumbled. I'm pretty apt with wheelchairs and strollers, and it wasn't the first time that I forgot my gloves at work. But pushing the old man up the ramp was harder than it should have been. While we waited for the elevator to come, I made a quick note to talk to the building manager about the rusty ramp. "Which floor will it be, mister?" Out of his rags, the man produced a crumbled piece of stained paper. He tried to make sense of the handwriting. "Ah, floor 7. Looks like we're neighbors." "Yes, 7th floor." The elevator creaked and groaned with its usual strains and dragged us up towards the roof of the complex. With the stinging pain fading from my eyes, I got a chance to look at the stranger. White hair with the consistency of spiderweb, skin and bone and stubble, a discomforting amount of swelling over his right eye. "So, Mr. New Neighbor, are you around these parts?" "No." "Are you from here?" "No." "I'm born and raised right here in this winter wonderland. Quick tip, don't ever turn that radiator knob lower than the maximum. It's a nice little home that we have here, but the heating system is back from the Soviet days. Tends to leak as soon as you tamper with it, and boy oh boy, are those things no fun to fix." No response. I was used to old folks being suspicious and quiet, but from my experience, once you talk for a bit, they tend to open up. My new neighbor wasn't like the other old-timers I've met. All that kept us company for the elevator ride was the choking and coughing of metal. "Here we are, 7th floor." He passed me the keys. They were covered in rust, but they fit the door. A stove, a bed, a window, the bare minimum for survival. All the Soviet-built housing projects have a sort of melancholy about them, but there was something especially desperate about that cramped room. An aura of dread and mildew flowed through the air. Then again, that could have just been the old man. As soon as I opened the door, my new neighbor wheeled himself to the window. "Well, like I said before, my name is Alexei. Nice to meet you." The old man didn't turn away from the window. Outside, the world was still. Nothing but a collection of snow-covered panel housing and flickering lamplight. I work in a supermarket, and they let me take food that's past its due date. There's nothing wrong with the food, just can't be sold. Would be ashamed to see it go to waste, so I bring it back to the folk over here. Quite a big haul today. Lots of beans. Would you like—" "I have nothing to give in return. Believe me, I've not come here to make friends. I've come here to die." I left the man 2 cans of beans on the stove. The weather was significantly kinder in the morning. Having a day off from work, I went to talk to the building manager about the ramp. We still had to wear scarves around our faces, but the icicles on the railing were starting to melt. As we cleared the ramp, we spoke of spring. Above my unit lives a single mother with a particularly noisy, yet adorable infant. When she saw the newly cleaned ramp, she was ecstatic. All of a sudden, the daily struggle of getting the carriage inside of the apartment complex was gone. It felt nice to know I'd managed to improve her life, if only just a little bit. Yet, she was not the neighbour who I was most concerned about. The mailbox for the old man's unit didn't have a name on it. Neither did his door. When I rang the doorbell, there was no answer. I pressed down on the bell for a bit, just in case the old man's hearing was bad. After about 30 seconds, he acknowledged me. "If you're here to rob me, I have nothing." "Not here to rob you, mister. It's me, Alexei, your neighbour. I've brought you more food." No response, but the door wasn't locked. He sat facing his window, just where I'd left him. The cans of beans, however, were empty. "Me and the building manager clean the ramp. Should have no troubles going up and down on your own. If you ever want company for a walk, though, I'd be more than happy to join you." "Why?" "Walks with strangers are pretty fun. The neighbourhood is a lot of concrete, but I think it has a certain charm to it. There's an abandoned hotel nearby where students get together and play jazz from time to time. Once it warms up, I'll be happy to take... Why do you help me?" That dread, that sense of discomfort was still in the air, but it wasn't as prominent as the evening prior. With the sun shining and the laughter of children echoing from the housing projects, the world seemed a bit more welcoming. Why do I help you? Because it's the right thing to do. God knows we have to help each other. It's a cold world out there. An aspiring saint. Helping those in need makes you feel powerful. It makes you feel special. I don't think I'm special, mister. I just like to help. I think most people are like that. His wheelchair creaked like nails on a chalkboard as he turned around to face me. His sunken eyes regarded me as if I were a maniac. Something had changed in his face from the day prior, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Most people want to help. Are you truly so naive as to believe in the goodness of mankind? What of the wars? What of the orchestrated famines? What of the men who forced Mayday parades through clouds of radiation? I shrugged. I try not to think about that. Don't see much of a point in it, mister. The Soviets are in the past. If we all work together, we can build a better world. The swelling that once existed beneath his right eye had now moved to the left, leaving behind dark, diseased skin. If you would have witnessed what I've witnessed, you would know how foolish you sound right now. All your thoughts of human goodness and charity dissipate in the face of reality. Man cannot rule over man. Staying in power requires an iron grip, and that grip, that cursed strangle of rule, will squeeze any semblance of humanity out of the ruler. If you would have seen what I've seen, you would know that no amount of charity can save us. What have you seen, mister? Makarov. Dr. Konstantin Makarov. The swelling around his left eye pulsed, causing him to grit his remaining teeth. The man had introduced himself as a doctor, but he clearly needed to go to the hospital. I was about to offer to take him to the nearby clinic, but before I had a chance to offer my help, he spoke once more. I have seen unspeakable horrors processed through flawed human systems. I've seen good men fall into despair in the face of this horrid reality that swirls beneath the facade of stability. My name is Konstantin Makarov, and I have worked. The children outside went silent. The lights in the apartment flickered in the same way they did before the blackouts of the 90s. The swollen flesh on Makarov's face throbbed, as if it was trying to reach past his skin. My name is Konstantin Makarov, and I have worked as a chief scientist in Illinois. Saying the words clearly drained the man, yet for all the weaknesses in his voice, the throbbing of swollen flesh on his forehead strengthened. With each shivering pulse, it seemed as if the infected skin was about to force its way out of its skull. I immediately grew worried for the old man. Dr. Makarov, your face. May I take you to the clinic? I have a friend there. I'm sure he would happily inspect you for free. The growth on your face looks... No. The rapid heartbeat in the old man's face died down. With a screech of rusted iron, he turned back around to the window. Down below, the neighborhood children were riding old plastic bags down a snowy hill. Please, just leave me be. I've not come here to be a charity case. I've come here to die. I thought of saying something, but I didn't. Instead, I just left the man another can of beans in the stove. The structure was said to be hidden in the forest that neighboured our housing projects. In educated circles, the structure was known as the building formerly known as the United People's Institution of Science. Around campfires in the village pubs, it was known as Illinois Duddy. When I was young, my uncle used to tell us stories about it. He described the place as an old Soviet science facility that dabbled in knowledge beyond the scope of human understanding. He spoke of monsters and curses and forbidden knowledge. I listened to his stories in rapt attention, but even as a child, I considered them to be fiction. As an adult, I considered it to be the byproduct of our collective imagination, a way to explain away the 60 years of harsh Soviet rule. After talking to Makarov, I wasn't so sure. The man was old, but he was not mad. Ilyondari existed, and he worked within its confines at some point. That was not what kept sleep away from me that night. It was the old man's eyes that convinced me that not only was that place real, but that at least some of the stories I heard about it were true. There was no doubt in my mind that Makarov had seen something unearthly in his previous work. The whole night through, all I could think of was that throbbing mass of flesh stemming from his skull. I spent most of my morning thinking about it too. I tried to figure out the source of the injuries, the way that something so discomforting could manifest. Yet all I found was pained empathy. Thoughts of swollen flesh followed me to my morning shift, where they metastasized into a burning migraine. By the time I got back home, I could barely think straight. I put aside the leftover groceries for later and settled down on the couch for a nap. I thought that after a bit of rest, I could go hand out the leftover food and check on Makarov. Yet sleep refused to come. Instead, I laid on the couch with stinging pain in my head and nausea rolling around in my stomach. There was tenseness in the air, like the kind that festers up when a fight is about to happen. I lay there, sick and anticipating something I couldn't put my finger on. Bzzzt. I came to the door before I had a chance to press the buzzer twice. Makarov's strange growth had shifted once more. Now it was sitting in between his eyes, making his face look like a highwayman mask made of bruises. Alexei, I'm not long for this world. I appreciate your help throughout my short time here, but there is one more favor I could ask of you. Seeing the poor Frau man dragged all of my attention away from the migraine. Of course, Dr. Makarov. How can I be of help? Take me to the roof. The roof? I don't think it's very safe there. You could easily... He looked sicker than before. Much sicker than before. A reason for why he would want to take me to the roof immediately struck me. I'm not looking to jump, if that's what you're thinking. No, Alexei. I merely want to see the sunset one last time. I fear my body will not make it through the night. I can take you to the clinic. Surely they can help you there. I'm much more qualified than any doctor at any clinic in this provincial town. I know the nature of my injuries, and I've made peace with them. Now please, neighbour, would you help me make my way to the roof? Beyond us stretched an infinitely repeating collection of cement colosseums. Below us, in the centre of each of the circular panel houses, children played. Their laughter echoed below us, a reminder of joy in a sea of brutalist architecture. See, Doctor, doesn't the neighbourhood have a charm about it? The old man was completely deaf to my attempts at small talk. He just stared into the steadily reddening sky, lost in his own thoughts. I've been part of something horrible. What do you mean, Doctor? I've been part of something horrible, and for decades I've stayed silent. I believe that what I did was for the greater good. I believed my work at the facility would usher in a new era of humanity. I believed that what I partook in was a necessary evil. But now that I sit here, now that all is done, I always had doubts. On a primal level, I knew that I was doing something wrong, but I've always denied myself the clarity of thought. The mass of flesh beneath his forehead started to pulse harder than it ever had before. Even past his bruises, the old man's skin was turning the colour of the setting sun. The growth on his forehead was completely foreign to me, but the look in his eyes was familiar. In my younger years, I volunteered at a hospice. Konstantin Makarov had the same look in his eyes of the soldiers brought back from the war. He had done something horrid and needed a chance to confess. I would not rob him of that right. What have you done, Dr. Makarov? A sharp wind drowned out the children below. The light started to seep out of the sky. With each moment that passed, the mass of flesh on Makarov's forehead grew more frenzied. The old man's speech came through choked gasps, yet he refused to give up. Parasite. When I worked at the United People's Institute of Science, I was tasked with the study of a parasite found in the nearby steppe. Profoundly fascinating organism capable of communication with other members of its species across the world. Indestructible, highly intelligent, physically decentralized. The more the organism grew, the closer it was to its descendants, the more dangerous it became. Yet, the scientific potential of this organism was limitless. I kept on telling myself all that was needed was more research. I kept on telling myself that the parasite's potential could be harnessed for the good of humanity. The pursuit of knowledge blinded me. It made me skip safety protocols. It made me reckless with my own flesh. The Soviets were not the only superpower in possession of the parasite. Across the Iron Curtain, a certain Dr. Groves was enlisted by the Americans to study the... We communicated. Markrav's entire body had flared up with that red pulse of flesh. Pulse of steam rose like a boiling kettle from beneath his scarf. Take your time, Doctor. Take a deep breath. I'm here to listen without judgment. Tell me what you need to get off your shoulders. With a deep, shivering groan, he continued. Chaos. When the satellite states started to fight for their independence, when the walls started to crumble, there was chaos. Groves and me used this chaos to transport the western breed of the organism. The Soviet Union was doomed to fail. The People's Institute of Science was doomed to fail. Yet, with the western breed of the organism, all of that would be irrelevant. The day the package arrived, the day the two halves combined into a greater whole, that was the end of the United People's Institute of Science. That was the day Eleanor Deri was born. For years, research continued under the parasite's leadership. We were making progress. We were gaining valuable information for the good of mankind, but the military, they left us alone for years. But once they realized the power that we held, I sacrificed my body to science. I sacrificed my body to the parasite to keep the Institute safe. The military incursion was taken care of quickly. They stood no match against. They were not prepared. They couldn't be. But my body, the parasite, it refused to give back control. It used me to feed. Above us, the stars painted a chaotic galaxy. The streets had gone silent. It was far too cold to be outside. Even past my thick gloves, I could feel my fingers going numb. Yet I knew that the shaking man in the wheelchair needed to speak. It used me. It used me to hunt, to feed, to grow, to spread. Dr. Markov, you're shaking. It's freezing. Please, let me take you to the clinic. Or, if not that, let me at least take you back downstairs. You're not well. You can leave if you need to, but I cannot go yet. It hasn't happened yet. What hasn't happened? The organism. It grew inside of me. It fed and killed and grew, and when my body could no longer hold it, it spread. Where did it spread to? The old man didn't respond. He simply sighed. The throbbing beneath his flesh was starting to calm. The look of tortured guilt in his eyes simmered down to resigned acceptance. Alexei, do you truly believe in the goodness of mankind? Yes. He sat in silence, his skin growing paler by the second. I guess it doesn't matter anymore. What's done is done. Thank you for all of your help. May you one day find forgiveness in your heart for what I have done. We all make mistakes, Dr. Markov. It's part of being human. Everyone deserves forgiveness. I don't. An explosion cracked the silent night in half. The housing projects lit up in the twin flames of rockets rising from the forest. The projectiles moved with dizzying speed towards the sky. As freezing as it was outside, a flurry of windows opened beneath us to see what was happening. Did those rockets come from the facility? The old man did not respond. He simply watched. Even past the diseased bruising on his face, I could see tears gathering at the edges of his eyes. The parasite spread throughout my body until it could be contained no more. Now it will spread much further. The rockets flew higher and higher, making their incursion on the starry sky. It wasn't until the sound of the thrusters had completely disappeared that they changed their trajectory. Each went in a different direction, drawing a line of white smoke through the black sky, growing smaller and smaller until... poof. Two tiny, silent explosions in the sky rained down bits of fiery debris all over the earth. Dr. Makarov, is that where the parasite spread? To the rockets? The old man did not reply. He was no longer shivering. His skin was bloodless. Dr. Makarov? His eyes were still dripping tears and looking at the sky. Yet the man wasn't breathing. I took off my glove, willed as much warmth into my fingers as I could, and slid them behind the old man's scarf. My fingers were numb, but the lack of a pulse was clear. The old man was dead, yet, just as I was about to pull my hand away from his corpse, I felt something. Up through his neck. Something moved. Something squirmed. Something was making its way up towards his jaw. Markov's head dropped to the side. His lips parted, and something horrible slid out. My fingers shook so much that it took me a couple of tries to dial the hospital. When the men finally arrived to retrieve the body, I let them into the apartment complex, but I refused to go with them to the roof. I couldn't stand to look at Konstantin Markov's shell of a body again. It reminded me far too much of what dwelled inside of it. A horrible mess of arteries and blood and muscle. It crawled out of his lips and dragged itself to the edge of the roof. I fear that the thing survived the fall, that it still lingers somewhere in the bushes below, that it is waiting for another victim somewhere in these housing projects. The image of that monstrosity of flesh crawling through the places where the children play haunts me. Yet there is another image which cuts my sanity much more. Somewhere in the stratosphere, two giant rockets carrying a horrible load, exploding. The thought of that flesh raining down on our Earth, of Markov's experiment being sown across the planet without warning, that is what truly haunts me.
My favorite story as a child was called The Hideous Hair. Of course, it went by other names depending on who was telling it, and what kind of mood they were in. My father never liked that name. When we were snuggled in bed, he sat by our nightstand with his fingers running over the grooves of a dollar store lamp. He called it the hag in the hair. If he felt especially adventurous, he'd replace hag with a word we weren't allowed to say, as the scrawny little 10-somethings that we were. The story in question was a well-loved one, passed down from our thrice-great-grandmother to her son, and from there to her daughter, and so on. All the way to our father. The lesson was simple enough to grasp, but it wasn't one learned by the glass slipper fitting on the princess's foot, or the frog shedding his slimy skin for that of a prince. Once upon a time, my father would say in a hushed tone as if he was telling us a secret tale that was only for Jacob's and my little ears. There was an old hag who lived in a tiny house in the middle of nowhere. The hag in question did live in the middle of nowhere, and behind her house was a vegetable garden. Rabbits would come and steal bites from her carrots and lettuce. She didn't like it, not one bit. She hated rabbits. So when fall raked the last of the trees bare, and the winter's cold fingers crept up ever so slowly, she sat in a rocking chair, reading how to get rid of the little bastards. And that's when she heard the very first knock. It wasn't an ordinary knock, mind you. It was a thump knock. She knew it must have been an animal at her door. When she moved to the door and threw it open, there stood a hare. It was white as the driven snow, but was by no means perfect. It bore mangled ears and an empty, bloodied socket where an eye used to be. The poor creature had seen some hardship, that was for sure, but of course the old woman had no sympathy. "Miss, if you might spare some warmth for the night, I would be forever in your debt. My warren has flooded with the autumn rain." My father would always pitch his voice up an octave and soften his eyes when voicing the rabbit. The hag's voice was always low, snapping tone, like dry twigs in a fire. For a moment the hag laughed. It was the laugh of a mean old bitch, the kind that made you think of ruby slippers and gingerbread houses. "You think I'm going to let a silly old rabbit stay the night in my house? That's a gag indeed. You better get off my porch or I'll get my gun and spatter your freaky little face all over it." The hare, terrified for its little life, bounded away into the thicket. The next evening was colder still. The thump knocking came again as the hag was embroidering a small fox into the middle of a flower ring. She loved foxes. Foxes eat rabbits. Of course, they also eat chickens, but all of hers had disappeared several winters ago under mysterious circumstances. She stood and threw open the door yet again. She met the chilling air with disgust, just as she did the rabbit's renewed pleading. "Miss, surely you can spare me a night's shelter. My body's so weak. I don't think I can stand another night in the cold. In this cold, hungry forest. I'll repay you however I'm able." There was no laugh from her lips this time. She only stared down at the bastard bunny. "You'd do better in the forest than you will if you keep tottering around my doorstep. Get gone, you hideous hare." With that, she made for the broom closet before it could feel the bite of straw. It scampered away into the thicket once more. The next evening, the first snow of winter had just begun to grace the ground. The hag sat by a roaring fire with a pot of tea and a small platter of cheese and bread. When the thump knocking came from the third and final time, she stormed over to the door and wrenched it open. She could barely contain her fury as the rabbit pleaded. "Please, miss, the snow has come and I'll freeze to the very death. One night out of the cold is all I ask, no more." She stomped her foot, barely missing its paw. At this point in the story, my dad would jump to his feet and stomp his foot onto the ground, spooking us without fail. "Then freeze! If I see you on my doorstep again, I'll skin you good, you wretched little thing." With that, she slammed the door, nearly crushing the poor hare in the process. The rabbit began to squeak with desperation. She snatched the cheese knife from the small end table and made for the door. The hare opened its mouth to speak, but the hag gave it no time. She angrily stepped out to snatch it up and skin it into a nice fur hat. But she missed. It gaily ran inside, slamming the door behind her. "Let me in! Let me in!" she cried as she heard the lock click into place. "You'd better get off my porch, or I'll skin you to a bloody pulp!" The rabbit sneered. After banging for several minutes, and a string of curses that would make the devil blush, she realized she was not getting back in and walked uncertainly into the night to beg for shelter, just as the hare had done. Sitting on the old oak steps of the front porch, I remember wondering if my dad would tell us that story that evening. He wasn't up for telling stories much nowadays. Now all we heard was his soft grieving from down the hall. That and the fire and brimstone, and the word of God from our aunt. There were many things our father wasn't up for anymore. Holding a job, feeding us, clothing us, caring for us when we were sick. That duty fell on my aunt, at her insistence. I read the passage over and over, absorbing almost none of it. My thoughts, scattered as they were interrupted by the crows of my aunt's rooster. I closed the Bible, placing it to the side, and watched the snow gently fall. Snow was an odd sight in November around these parts. But the weatherman on the old fuzzy TV had said a cold front was coming from the northwest. The cornstalks swayed in the gentle breeze, and amidst it all sat the scarecrow. It was no ordinary scarecrow. It didn't know who made it, but it bore the face of a malnourished rabbit. A ridge above where each eye would have been cast deep shadows on its face, and its burlap skin was pulled tight, giving it a gaunt face to match its tattered ears. The body was painfully low effort compared to the face, consisting of only 2 tree branches and a burlap bag stuffed with hay, all tied to a post. As the snow continued to fall, it dusted its limbs gently in white. My childish brain was stuck with the notion that the scarecrow might be cold. I stood then, walking back into the house. My steps were light as I crept to the front closet. In the time I'd been living in that old farmhouse, I knew that the less noise I made, the less my existence mattered. Generally, one would view that as a negative thing, but to me, it meant avoiding confrontation. I wasn't so lucky that night, though. It couldn't always be avoided. "Just what the hell do you think you're doing?" my aunt snapped as I reached for the spare winter coat in the closet. The smell of sap clung to her skin and stained her fingers like blood. I considered myself lucky she did not still hold the axe. I was so caught off guard that I gave her my honest answer. "I'm getting a coat for the scarecrow. It's cold." She let out a mirthless laugh. It was her way of saying, "No, the hell you aren't," without wasting her words. She slammed the closet door shut, nearly catching my fingers. I jumped. "Where's the Bible I gave you?" I realized a moment before the back of her firm, bony hand hit the back of my head that it was still sitting outside on the porch. "Go get that damn Bible! You should be ashamed, leaving the good book out in the elements like that. Rotten." So, like the rotten child I was, I immediately ran back outside to retrieve the Bible. The snow was falling thicker now. The graceful flakes mashed into blustery gray. The air tasted like dirty ice and pine. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I clutched the Bible. The scarecrow was still sitting at its diligent watch. For a moment, I imagined it shivering in the cold. And that's when I made up my mind. The yellow grass crackled under my feet. It was the kind that stayed perpetually crunchy, even in the lushest of springs. "Hello," I said meekly as I came to stop right in front of it. "I thought you might like a little company." The harecrow gave no reply. I found myself relieved that it had not spoken back, as if that was a reasonable thing to fear in the first place. "You look lonely and cold. So I came to give you this." I shrugged the jacket from my shoulders and stood on my tiptoes to affix it to his branchy ones. The breeze that swayed the cornstalks slowly died. The quiet was serene until it went on for too long. I felt the cold fingers of observance creep up my back. Something was watching me. "How can you watch the fields if you don't have any eyes?" I asked, mostly to break the silence. "Here, let me fix that for you. Everyone deserves to see, especially you. You have such a nice view of the sunset." I took out the permanent marker I left in my overall pocket from when Aunt Rachel had made me copy Bible verses earlier after I couldn't find her misplaced axe. I was nearly unable to reach, but I managed to give it the best rabbit-looking eyes I could. We stood there for a moment, observing each other. Finally, I turned back. "I'll see you again soon." I tossed over my shoulder as I began to brisk walk back to the warmth of the house. My aunt was mercifully drooling in her rocking chair, some late-night program droning on behind her snores. My father was awake in his room, even though I couldn't hear his voice. His grief was loud enough. I sat the Bible down on the china cabinet. My shoulders hadn't stopped shaking, and I blew into my red hands, trying to bring the feeling back to them. "You really are one of a kind." The scent of cocoa rised from the pot that Jacob was stirring, warm and inviting. He was the one lucky enough to be able to use the stove out of the two of us. "I watched you out of the window, you know." My shoulders relaxed. They'd been tense since meeting the Scarecrow, for no particular reason. It had been only Jacob's eyes on me. "I don't know why you get so close to that Scarecrow, much less give it your jacket. That thing freaks me out," he confessed, as he poured the steaming chocolate into 2 silver mugs. I sighed. "Nobody deserves to be alone," was all I could say. He rubbed his thumb over his bottom lip for a few moments, something he did when he was lost in thought. And then he smiled. "Fair enough. But you better not go asking me for any of my clothes when yours are on that rabbit out there. You'll be running around yelling, 'My shoes, my shoes, the rabbit took my shoes.' You'll just have to be barefoot as that Scarecrow tap dances all the way to New York City in your little Chuck Taylors." We both howled with laughter at this, until we nearly woke my aunt. Once we drained our mugs and our bodies had returned to its normal temperature, we moved up the creaking old stair to our bedroom. Worn white sheets swallowed us whole. We both fell into a comfortable silence. There was no bedtime story from our father that night. Just as the first rays of sun were creeping over the windowsill and the rats in the walls were beginning to quiet, our Aunt Rachel woke us up for school with little more than a "Breakfast is downstairs, don't be late." She was a brash woman. Some would call her behavior abusive, and they'd be right. But in those days, it was all filed under the all-too-broad label of strict. Still, she did the bare minimum of keeping us alive and healthy. As I walked out onto the porch, where the thin layers of snow from the night before had begun to melt, I saw my jacket. Jacob dragged behind me, and I wondered if it was him who'd retrieved the jacket and left it there on the porch so our aunt wouldn't turn my backside inside out. I just shrugged and I put it on. Jacob met me at the bottom step with our school bags, and off we went. It wasn't a long walk to and from school. The town had one bus, one route. It didn't end up in our neck of the woods for one reason or another. Though school was a safe haven, I hadn't made many friends there. Today would be the day that changed that. That day was the day where the teacher stood at the front of the class with a girl clutching the black strap of her Lisa Frank backpack and introduced Naomi to the class. When I met the girl who showed me her favorite books amongst the middle school library shelves, when I met the girl who held my hand in the hallway and gave me a quick, innocent kiss behind the tunnel in the rickety playground, that day changed my life forever. I skipped down the dirt road home. Jacob tried his best to keep up with me. The breath of honeysuckle flowers in the air felt sweeter that afternoon. "What's got you about to fly away? Geez, you're like a kite." For the first time since getting to school that morning, I felt a note of hesitation. I mean, sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had kept a secret. So I hadn't found validation in Jacob. I scanned around and then whispered as if the very trees and dirt had eyes and ears. "I kissed a girl today, Jake." Instead of a spiel about how it was wrong, like some part of me expected, an "ooh" rose from his mouth. The kind of jeering that fills classrooms when somebody gets called to the principal's office. "Pandora has a crush on somebody? Is it the new girl?" We spent the last leg of our journey home lightheartedly bickering back and forth as siblings tend to do. It was only when the house came into view that Jacob grabbed my arm and stopped me. There was a deep sadness in his voice. Pandora, listen to me. This is important. Whatever you do, you cannot tell Aunt Rachel about this, okay? She won't like it. I want you to keep it a secret between us for now, okay? At that time, it didn't click in my mind why he'd said that. The bruises of Jacob's arms and legs, the cries of unclean for my aunt, and the sad look he often had in his eyes in that year that we lived with her never truly hit me until the day it did. We got inside and were immediately put to work on the back garden. The afternoon moved slower than a slug in molasses until Aunt Rachel sent us to bed after a meal of watery chicken stew and 2 hot baths. My muscles ached as I pulled open our window. I paused, listening for Jacob's slow and even breathing. And when he didn't stir, I climbed out onto the front porch roof. I slid down the wooden support and turned my eyes out to the field. There sat the scarecrow. The half moon hung low in the sky above it, a yellow and slightly sour lemon wedge. I walked up to him as if approaching an old friend. Mr. Haircrow? No, that's not right. You need a name. Everybody needs a name. How about Frith? The name had worked its way out of the corners of my mind. From when I lifted Watership down from the high school only section of the library. It fit in a way that I knew nothing else would. The wind made the cornstalks sway, almost in approval. I smiled. I love names, especially Naomi. I love the name Naomi. I imagine the scarecrow was giving me a knowing look. Okay, I know. I'll tell you what happened. So just like with my brother, I relayed my secret in a quiet tone, as if I was telling it the directions to some treasure deep in a swamp. Frith, for his part, listened patiently and quietly. I talked with him until the first hints of the sun lightened the sky. Once I realized that dawn was fast approaching, I scrambled back into the roof and into my bed. I thought you'd gone and gotten yourself killed. I heard him before I saw him. Jacob was sitting up with his eyes weak from sleep. Then I went and looked out of the window. Why do you like that scarecrow so much? It gives me the creeps. I sighed, and I began to change out of my pajamas and into school clothes. I hadn't shut my eyes the entire night. School would be exhausting today, even if it was better than here. He looks lonely. Nobody deserves to be alone. And I know I'm the only one who's brave enough to go spend time with him. I paused to pull on my shoes before adding, "No offense, Jacob." He pulled himself out of bed. The cycle of school, chores, homework, bed started all over again. Whatever free time I had was spent with my brother, my nose in whatever books I could hide from my aunt, or talking with my quiet friend Frith. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months turned into nearly a year. My aunt only got worse in her treatment of us. The night that we were sent to bed without supper, and the pages of Bible verses we had written gradually grew in number. We saw very little of our father during that time. Only the ghosts of his footprints moving to and from the kitchen or bathroom at odd hours of the night, and the whispers of weeping for our mother and his wife. I never blamed him for turning a blind eye to our abuse. And I still don't. He was at the bottom of an inescapable ocean. That's why when he walked in on the night of Halloween, after we'd been sent to bed without supper yet again, Jacob and I were shocked to see him appear in our doorway. He looked fragile, in the purest sense of the word. His perpetual sore eyes crisscrossed with red veins. He'd eaten very little food in the months since we'd gotten here, and his figure reflected that. He was more rake than man. He ran a hand through his matted orange hair and sucked in a breath through chapped lips. I held in my tears at the sight of him. You kiddos have time for a bedtime story? I saw the renewed joy in his eyes when our faces lit up. I think we can fit you into our schedule, Jacob said in a breathless, happy voice. He sat down on the end of my bed as Jacob flew across the room to us. Our father started a tale about a little girl living high in a tower, but I stopped him. Dad, you should tell us something scary. It's Halloween after all. He rubbed his scruffy chin as he considered my request. You two are awfully young for that sort of thing, aren't you? I laughed a little. Dad, I'm 13. For a moment, his eyes filled with sorrow. I knew now what that look meant. It was one of a man watching the lives of his kids slip by him, knowing that he wasn't present for it. Yeah, I guess you're right. After several long moments of deep thought, our father began to weave a tale about two little girls wandering in the forest on Halloween to find a magic well, only to find out it was haunted. It wasn't his best, but it kept us gripped until the very end. When the story concluded, he stood up and rubbed his face. I love you both so much. Don't ever forget that. He reached out a hand and offered us both a small brownie in the shape of a jack-o'-lantern. Our aunt didn't believe in Halloween, so there was no hoard of treats for us to be had. Jacob and I eagerly took the treats, and our dad smiled as we filled our stomachs with sweet chocolate goodness. He got to his feet and wiped at his perpetually weepy eyes. I'll be around more for you two now. I promise. I can't say for certain whether he would have kept that promise or not. I like to think that he would have. The weekend slipped by like a fish in oil. I stood in my locker after lunch Monday, searching for my math book. My face flushed when I felt two firm fingers press on my shoulder blade. You'll never guess what I saw, Naomi whispered, as if she'd seen in the King Tut's tomb. I stood turning towards her. Her eyes were soft but sly. She was hell on wheels, but she made my heart sing. What? Don't leave me in suspense. She nodded towards the block of lockers where the obnoxious teen boys would often mill about and said, See that locker over there? There's something in it. A Playboy. I was a sheltered child. She said the word Playboy with a drama that didn't land for me. What's that? She took my hand as we crept down the hall. It was beginning to empty out as stir-crazy kids piled into the worn jungle gyms and swings outside. It's a magazine with naked ladies. My jaw dropped. Seriously? I think I can get it for us, she said with a grin. The concept of something so scandalous and private, in my young mind being proudly on display along with my still emerging sexuality, made it an offer too tempting to pass up. We found the locker in question, and she held a callous hand up to her ear as she worked the cheap blue lock. Naomi was an artist, and her medium was mischief. When the padlock popped open with ease, she handed it to me. You do the honors. No snooping. We just want the magazine. Naomi had a strange sense of morals about such things. Thievery was fair game.